2 years ago, a Reddit user asked,
What is the current state of emulation for the PS3 on Android? I know the architecture for the PS3 is a mess, but has anyone started working on coding or anything?
This sparked an interesting discussion. Rushmore69 replied,
Maybe in 5 years. The games are storage hogs. I removed them from my deck, so current storage sizes wouldn't fare too well and would need expanded storage to return. Probably not happening.
To this, Dryfoot479D responded,
That's your takeaway for emulating PS3 games, that they're big? It's funny to me that everyone in this thread is so quick to say, no way. I remember reading old threads in this subreddit 2 years ago saying a PS2 emulator that wasn't Damon was still years away, and then Tall dropped that shit like 3 months later by everyone's surprise, and it was baller. Do I think that will happen with PS3? Nope. Did I think that was gonna happen with PS2? Nope. But guessing a time is impossible, despite what people think, unless it's something super outrageous.
This exchange highlights the skepticism surrounding PS3 emulation and the occasional surprises in the emulation community. Progress often comes out of nowhere, with breakthroughs defying expectations. Unfortunately, the emulation scene has also been plagued by fake emulators such as RPCS3 Emulator, Ps3 Emulator, Ps3 Games Emulator Offline, and my personal favorite, Ps3 Simulator. Seeing people fall for these fake emulators is both frustrating and disheartening. While researching Ps3 emulation, I stumbled upon a hilarious article on litmag.com titled, How to Play PS3 Games on Android Using a Ps3 Emulator. As someone very active in the emulation community, I knew the article was complete nonsense. In the first 2 paragraphs, the author boldly claimed that Android devices had become powerful enough to run Ps3 games. They seem to be referring to running Ps3 games on virtual machines or alternative operating systems like Linux. Suspicious, but okay. The article continued with the heading, What is Ps3 Emulation on Android? It provided a basic explanation of emulation, but bizarrely claimed that the popular PPSSPP emulator could play some PS3 games. Next came the system requirements for this alleged PS3 emulator, and here's where it got even funnier. Processor, Qualcomm Snapdragon 865 or higher, or equivalent.
RAM at least 6GB. GPU, Adreno 650 or newer for handling complex graphics. Storage, minimum of 64GB free space for emulator files and game ROMs. Android version, Android 10 or later.
The author claimed these specs would ensure smooth gameplay with no major issues like lag or graphical glitches. While these might be realistic for a hypothetical PS3 emulator, it's clear even this setup wouldn't run games without significant issues. The next part was even wilder. The article claimed there was a native port of RPCS3 for Android that actively supported a wide range of games. It even doubled down on the earlier claim that PPSSPP could run PS3 games, likely confusing PSP titles like Dante's Inferno and Tekken 6, which were also available on PS3. Finally, the article reached peak absurdity with the claim that these games were compatible. 1. The Last of Us.
2. Uncharted series. 3. God of War 3, 4. Little Big Planet 5. Gran Turismo 6, 6. Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots.
This article was clearly written for gullible 13-year-olds. But enough of the nonsense, let's dive into the real discussion.
The PS3 boasts an impressive library of exclusive titles, including God of War, Uncharted, and PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, where you can even play as the iconic Toru Inoue. Seriously, I'd love to play as Toru Inoue again. However, with Sony discontinuing the PS3, the only way to enjoy these games today is through emulation. When it comes to PS3 emulation, there's really only one remarkable emulator, RPCS3. It's available on Windows, Linux, and macOS and has made tremendous progress in making PS3 games playable. Interestingly, even Sony's PS4 didn't include backward compatibility for PS3 games. The PS5 doesn't either, despite supporting PS4 games and even some PS2 games via emulators. So why does PS3 backward compatibility remain such a challenge?
More importantly, why isn't there a PS3 emulator for Android?
Why are developers hesitant to tackle PS3 emulation?
And is there any way to play PS3 games on Android? If so, how? Hello everyone, it's Kuro and Violet here. Today we'll try to answer why there is no PS3 emulator for Android and why it's so hard to emulate PS3. But before starting this video, I want to tell you that we are not an expert in this field, and everything we'll say in this video is based on the research we did. We've tried to keep the information as accurate as possible.
We are also learning about these things, so if we say something wrong in the video, please feel free to correct us in the comments. We would love to learn more as someone passionate about emulators, software, and hardware. Let's get started.
But first, let's discuss everything that has happened regarding PS3 emulation on Android up until now. If you've been following the Android emulation scene, you've probably noticed that no legitimate PS3 emulator has ever been developed for the platform. However, there was a time when a YouTube channel promised something revolutionary, a PS3 emulator called Artemis. It sparked excitement in the community, with a trailer and gameplay footage showcasing what seemed like perfectly smooth PS3 emulation on Android. But on closer inspection, things didn't add up. The on-screen controls didn't sync with the gameplay, and the games ran flawlessly without any graphical issues, something highly unrealistic for PS3 emulation on Android. As it turned out, Artemis was nothing more than a hoax. Later, with the rise of Windows emulators like Exagear, Mobox, and Winlator, some enthusiasts tried running RPCS3, the popular PS3 emulator for PC, through these emulators. Unfortunately, these attempts were largely unsuccessful. Running an emulator within another emulator, a layer within a layer, is a resource-intensive process that Android devices simply can't handle effectively.
Later, another alleged PS3 emulator for Android emerged, calling itself Blackhawk. It claimed to be the first PS3 emulator for Android, but this too sparked controversy. It wasn't an actual emulator. It simply used Wine to run RPCS3. Soon, Blackhawk rebranded as Anstation 3, generating more drama. While some dismissed it as another scam, including prominent creators like Mr. Sujano, others genuinely believed in and supported it, such as YouTuber Aptrex. As for my views, I think it was a cool project to experiment with, but you can't just do that, even if RPCS3 is an open source project. I don't have a strong opinion on this matter, but I don't consider it a scam. Then again, what do I know? I'm just a noob. Anyways, the controversy caught the attention of the RPCS3 team, who indirectly addressed it by tweeting,
We are aware of several PS3 scam emulators roaming around, especially for mobile platforms where the targeted audience doesn't understand much about tech. We remind everyone that RPCS3 is not natively available for Android or iOS, and we will not be porting it to these platforms.
This statement split the community. Some supported the RPCS3 team, while others felt the wording was too harsh. For example, a Reddit user named VinSmokeFoodBoy commented,
Look, I'm not supporting them, but RPCS3 devs also bullshitting here a bit. That never claimed to be a direct port. It literally states all about termux and fex on the website, and you apparently need to download those too. Now, do I think you should get it? No, because who knows what it contains, and even if it works, you ain't gonna get much out of it. But yeah, the wording should have been better on RPCS3's part.
As debates raged on, the Anstation 3 developer made bold claims, saying he would create a native PS3 emulator for Android, a questionable statement given the PS3's complexity, which we'll discuss later. To his credit, it's an immense challenge for even a talented developer, especially without a team. Eventually, Anstation 3 was released to the public. While some games booted, they were unplayable due to the layered approach. Shortly after, the developer abandoned the project, citing personal reasons like being a student and the technical challenges of porting RPCS3 natively to Android with no support from the community.
In the meantime, RPCS3 released builds for ARM-based Linux, macOS, and Windows. They even showcased PS3 emulation on a Raspberry Pi 5 running Linux. While the Raspberry Pi lacks the power for full-fledged PS3 emulation, it was interesting to see it working on such hardware. However, the RPCS3 team reiterated that they had no plans to port RPCS3 to Android. This decision sparked speculation. A user on notebookchat.com commented,
It seems like the RPCS3 team is playing a bit of a strategic game here. By keeping things under wraps regarding their plans for Android and iOS, they're likely trying to stir some buzz and grab media attention. Let's face it, there's way more excitement and potential for funding when you keep people guessing about what's next. When it comes to something like a PS3 emulator for Raspberry Pi, it's a pretty hard sell. We all know those little devices are cool, but don't really have the muscle for PS3 games. It's just not a practical move. But on the flip side, there's definitely more juice to squeeze if they explore ports for Apple's ARM chips or Windows ARM. Those platforms can handle a more serious emulator, and the demand is definitely there among gamers. Now, looking at the Android emulation scene, it's exploding right now. There's so much activity and passion in that community, and it feels a bit odd for RPCS3 to just sit back and say they won't support it publicly. I mean, That kind of stance can easily come off as just a way to create hype without really committing to anything. They might have their reasons, but it raises eyebrows, especially when there's a vibrant ecosystem just waiting for something like a PS3 emulator to drop.
Despite the challenges, some enthusiasts continued experimenting. For example, one Reddit user managed to run Rayman on RPCS3 using a rooted Xiaomi Pad 5 with Linux installed. Coincidentally, the same tablet variant I own, though it wasn't me. Recently, a new emulator called Olympus Ps3 Emulator was released, using Termux and Linux to run RPCS3. Surprisingly, it offered decent performance for some games, even with the layered approach. I've also tested this emulator and will discuss it later in the video. This brings us to the big question. Why isn't there a PS3 emulator for Android?
While other consoles have multiple emulators, Switch has Yuzu, Ryujinx, and Skyline, even PS4 emulation on PC has 2 options. Why doesn't the PS3 have the same?
And if the Switch is more powerful than the PS3, why is there a Switch emulator but not a PS3 emulator? Let's dive into these questions and uncover the answers. There are many reasons why PS3 emulation is so challenging, but one of the main reasons lies in its unique and complex architecture. But before we move on, if you're enjoying this so far, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more detailed and in-depth videos like this one. Your support really helps. Now let's dive into the PS3's architecture. To keep things simple, I'll briefly explain all the key components of the motherboard before we focus on the main parts. What you're looking at here is the motherboard of the original PS3, also known as the Fat PS3. It's packed with fascinating hardware that made the console ahead of its time. Let's break it down piece by piece. Note, some parts might not be crucial for understanding, but I prefer to provide a complete picture rather than leave things half-explained. 1. Emotion Engine plus Graphics Synthesizer. Originally from the PlayStation 2, this chip enabled early PS3 models to play PS2 games. It handles both the CPU and GPU functions for backward compatibility. 2. 16 MB RD RAM. This memory is dedicated to the Emotion Engine for PS2 emulation. 3. Cell Broadband Engine. This is the main processor and the brain of the PS3. We'll dive into its complexities in detail later. 4. NVIDIA Reality Synthesizer, RSX. The PS3's GPU, developed by NVIDIA, is responsible for rendering the high-quality graphics and visuals that the console is known for. Number 5. 4 64 MB XDR DRAM chips. These are the PS3's main RAM modules. This is an essential part of the system, and we'll cover it in more detail later. 6. Southbridge. This acts as the controller hub, managing I/O operations such as communication between USB ports, the hard drive, and other peripherals. 7. Ethernet controller. Handles the PS3's network connectivity, enabling online gaming, downloading updates, and internet browsing. 8. 128 MB NAND flash. Storage space dedicated to holding the PS3's system firmware. 9. Starship 2. A bridge chip that connects the Southbridge with the cell and RSX components. 10. SATA HDD socket, the connection point for the PS3's hard drive where games, updates, and other data are stored.
11. SATA to PATA bridge. You might wonder, what the heck is SATA and PATA? Well, let me explain. These are small hardware interfaces responsible for transferring data from storage devices, like hard drives, to the motherboard. Both serve the same purpose, but SATA is the newer, faster, and more efficient standard, while PATA is the older, slower version. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The PS3 uses the faster SATA standard for data transfer, but remember when I talked about the Southbridge earlier? That part of the PS3's motherboard only understands PATA signals. To bridge this gap, the PS3 needs to convert SATA signals into PATA signals, which is where the SATA to PATA bridge comes in. 12. Multi-AV encoder converts digital video signals into analog for output via the multi-AV port, enabling connections to older TVs. 13. HDMI encoder converts video signals into HDMI format for output to high-definition displays. 14. Multi-AV port provides audio and video output for analog connections. 15. HDMI port outputs high-definition video and audio through an HDMI cable. 16. RJ45 port, the Ethernet port for wired internet connectivity. 17. Toslink port, optical audio output for delivering high-quality digital audio. 18. 2x USB 2.0 ports, 2 sets. These ports allow you to connect controllers, storage devices, and other USB peripherals. 19. USB hub distributes power and data communication between the multiple USB ports. 20. Syscon, a system controller chip responsible for power management and ensuring all motherboard components function in sync. 21. CMOS port, stores BIOS settings and maintains the system time when the console is powered off. Now, let's dive deeper into some of the main components to understand their significance better.
Before diving into the PS3's design, let's first understand the traditional architecture used in modern consoles like the Xbox 360, PS4, PS5, and PCs. Understanding traditional architecture provides a foundation. The emulation community has studied and understood this architecture well enough to develop emulators without needing to dissect a console's internals from scratch. Its familiarity and predictability simplify development compared to unconventional designs like the PS3's. CPU, Central Processing Unit. The CPU is the brain of a console, handling multiple tasks simultaneously. Modern CPUs typically use a general-purpose architecture where cores can perform various tasks efficiently. Imagine the CPU as a team of chefs in a kitchen. Each chef is versatile. They can chop, cook, or plate food as needed. This flexibility ensures the kitchen runs smoothly and can handle any type of order. For instance, the Xbox 360 uses a triple-core processor called Xenon. All 3 cores are general-purpose, capable of handling any task assigned. It's like having 3 equally skilled chefs in the kitchen who can multitask efficiently. This design, while based on PowerPC, is still considered traditional because of its flexibility, making it easier for developers to program and emulator developers to replicate. Enter the PS3's CPU. Now imagine a very different kitchen setup. Instead of general-purpose chefs, you have a head chef who doesn't cook but gives orders to 7 assistants. Each assistant is a specialist. One chops vegetables, another roasts chicken, and so on. These assistants are incredibly fast at their specific tasks, but can't handle anything outside their expertise. This is how the PS3's CPU, the Cell Broadband Engine, functions. It consists of 1. A Central Processing Unit, PPE, that acts as the head chef, giving orders but doing minimal processing itself. 2. 7 specialized cores called SPEs, Synergistic Processing Elements, each designed for a specific type of task. While each SPE is exceptionally fast at its assigned job, it's not flexible. For example, one SPE might handle physics calculations, another might process audio, a third might handle AI or graphics tasks. The challenge lies in programming this system and emulating it. Developers must carefully assign tasks to each SPE and manage their communication with the PPE. The complexity increases further because the PPE and SPEs don't communicate as seamlessly as general-purpose cores in traditional CPUs. Replicating the PS3's CPU in an emulator means 1. Simulating the specialized tasks of each SPE. 2. Managing the coordination and communication between the PPE and SPEs. 3. Balancing performance without overwhelming the host system. It's like trying to manage a kitchen where every chef specializes in only one dish, and they all need to work together in perfect harmony to complete a meal. For emulator developers, this is an incredibly complex system to replicate, especially compared to the straightforward general-purpose design of traditional CPUs. This is just one of the major hurdles in PS3 emulation. Next, we'll explore how its GPU and memory architecture add even more layers of complexity.
Reason 2. The split RAM. In most modern systems, RAM is shared between the CPU and GPU. This shared memory design is efficient because it allows flexibility. If the GPU needs more RAM, the CPU can temporarily sacrifice some, and vice versa. However, the PS3's architecture is very different. Its 512 megabytes of total RAM is split into 256 megabytes of XDR DRAM, dedicated solely to the cell processor, 256 megabytes of GDDR3, reserved exclusively for the RSX GPU. This split design means the CPU and GPU cannot share memory. If one runs out of RAM, it cannot borrow from the other. Developers back then had to carefully optimize their games to work within these constraints, balancing resources to avoid bottlenecks. Now this split RAM architecture poses a significant challenge for emulator developers. Emulation is all about replicating the original hardware as closely as possible, which means mimicking this memory limitation. It's especially tricky on modern hardware like Android devices, which use unified memory systems, making the split design a tough task to emulate accurately. You might wonder, why would Sony split the RAM, knowing that 256 megabytes per pool was insufficient even for its time? The answer lies in cost and technology. At the time, XDR DRAM was cutting-edge memory with high bandwidth and low latency, making it perfect for the PS3's powerful cell processor. However, it was also very expensive. To keep production costs somewhat manageable, Sony used 256 megabytes of XDR DRAM for the CPU and paired it with 256 megabytes of GDDR3 RAM for the RSX GPU. While this decision helped reduce costs, it created challenges, especially for cross-platform games. Developers had to work extra hard to optimize their games for the PS3's memory constraints. However, some PS3 exclusives, like The Last of Us, managed to fully exploit the split RAM design, showcasing the console's true potential.
Reason 3. The RSX GPU. The RSX GPU in the PS3 was a custom graphics processor developed by NVIDIA based on their GeForce 7800 architecture. While it wasn't as revolutionary as the cell processor, its tight integration with the PS3's unique hardware adds a lot of complexity to emulation. The RSX didn't use standardized APIs like Vulkan, DirectX, or OpenGL. Instead, Sony built custom APIs specifically for the PS3. This meant that emulator developers couldn't rely on established frameworks. They had to reverse engineer everything from scratch. Reverse engineering isn't unique to the PS3. Other retro systems like the PS2 or Sega Dreamcast also relied on proprietary APIs, requiring emulation developers to painstakingly figure out how they worked. It's a good reminder to always appreciate the hard work of emulator developers, as these challenges are no small feat to overcome.
There are many more architectural reasons behind the PS3's complexity, but we'll leave it at this point. By now, you can already feel the challenges involved. Every retro console, from the PS2, GameCube, to the Sega Dreamcast, had architectures far removed from modern systems. However, their designs were more predictable and easier to work with compared to the PS3. This unpredictability didn't just make emulation harder, it also affected cross-platform games. For example, despite the PS3 being more powerful on paper, the Xbox 360 often ran the same games better. The PS3's complex architecture created optimization headaches for developers, putting it at a disadvantage in multi-platform titles. When it comes to emulation, however, RPCS3 has achieved what once seemed impossible. Running PS3 games on RPCS3 requires a high-spec PC, which typically has superior cooling systems and far more power than mobile devices. This might explain why the RPCS3 team hasn't prioritized an Android port just yet. That said, modern mobile chips, such as the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 or 8 Gen 2 with proper cooling, could potentially handle some PS3 games decently, in my speculation. Interestingly, RPCS3 has recently released an ARM version of their emulator. Since mobile phones are also based on ARM architecture, this could open the door for a future Android port. While there are no guarantees, it's an exciting prospect. Another possible reason for the lack of an Android port is the low reputation of the Android emulation community, an issue exacerbated by incidents like the Ether SX2 controversy and the Sudachi incident. While I won't delve into the details of these controversies, they have left some developers wary of working on Android emulators. As mentioned earlier, the ARM version of RPCS3 has shown promise. Some enthusiasts have installed Linux on their devices and managed to run games like Rayman at decent FPS using RPCS3. However, installing Linux typically requires rooting, which voids the phone warranty and introduces other risks, making it an unpopular choice for many, including me. For those unwilling to root their devices, there's another intriguing option, the Olympus Ps3 Emulator. Similar to Anstation 3, Olympus runs RPCS3 on Linux using Termux, providing an alternative to Wine. While it still involves a layer-within-layer setup, Olympus benefits from Linux being lighter than Wine, allowing for better performance. Additionally, it takes advantage of the ARM version of RPCS3, which aligns better with mobile hardware.
Let's dive deeper into my experience with the Olympus Ps3 Emulator, which has been generating quite a buzz lately. While I explain, you'll see gameplay footage running in the background, giving you a visual idea of how the emulator performed during my tests. I've been testing Olympus on my Xiaomi Pad 5 for a while now. It's been an interesting yet challenging journey, but that's to be expected. My Pad 5 isn't a high-end device, and the emulator is still in its early development stages. Emulating PS3 games is no easy task, considering the PS3's notoriously complex hardware design. Olympus is trying to tackle that challenge, and despite the issues, it shows promise. One of the first hurdles I encountered was the lack of controller support. Initially, I had to rely on a keyboard for controls, which, let's face it, isn't the best option for games that demand precision. But after some digging, I discovered a way to use a controller, thanks to a YouTube channel I came across. While that was a win, the main challenge remained. Not a single game ran perfectly on my device. The first game I tested was Infamous. Surprisingly, it made it to the opening cutscene before freezing. For an early-stage emulator, that was impressive, but I couldn't get past the freeze. Next, I tested Dragon Ball Z. It booted into the game, and I was optimistic, but severe graphical glitches turned everything into black and white, making it unplayable. Still, it was a step forward since I hadn't expected it to even load. I then moved on to Toro's Party. Initially, it kept crashing, but after a lot of trial and error, I managed to get it to load into the game. Unfortunately, it faced major graphical issues. Only text was visible. Eventually, it crashed again. I considered tweaking the settings further, but I decided to set it aside for now. Besides, I was more tempted to return to playing Summertime Saga. Determined, I tested more games. Titles like Naruto, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Project Diva, and Rayman all ran into similar issues. Either crashes, freezes, or severe graphical glitches. The same story repeated with Catherine, Akiba's Trip, and Killzone 2. Despite my efforts, none of these games were playable in their current state. I do believe some of these problems might be resolved with specific settings tweaks. Now, let's dive into some indie games I should have tested earlier. Starting with Shovel Knight, it ran smoothly without any hiccups. However, I noticed that the on-screen control tricks I've been using weren't ideal due to the touch controls not being very responsive. So, if you're planning to test it yourself, I'd recommend using a keyboard for a better experience. Next up was Limbo, which also performed as expected, running seamlessly. At this point, I thought all lightweight games would run easily. But when I tested Fat Princess, it surprised me. It didn't even boot for some reason. I think this initial round of testing is enough for an introductory video. I'll explore more games with different settings in future videos, especially if I manage to get some mid-weight games running. Olympus has potential, especially if the developers continue improving the ARM version of RPCS3 and enhancing the translation layers. However, there's a concern that development may slow down or even stop, as Olympus isn't directly tied to RPCS3's main branch. Updates may become less frequent over time. If you happen to know more about the emulator's status or its future, let me know in the comments. There's limited information available, and I'd love to hear your insights.
If you're curious about how other games perform, I recommend checking out some dedicated channels that actively test a wide variety of titles. They've done an excellent job showcasing the emulator's current capabilities. For now, all we can do is wait for a stable PS3 emulator to arrive on Android, especially after the official RPCS3 Twitter handle confirmed that mobile phones are capable of running some lightweight PS3 games. It sparks speculation that they might be working on something behind the scenes, or simply waiting for mobile hardware to evolve enough to handle heavier games. However, it's hard to say for sure, especially given the notoriously complex architecture of the PS3, which we just discussed in this video. Personally, I would love to play PS3 games on Android. There's so much potential in being able to run PS3 games on a portable device. If a legit PS3 emulator drops, I'll definitely test it extensively and make a detailed video about it. It's exciting to think about the possibilities, especially since emulation on mobile devices is advancing so quickly. But until then, we're stuck with the waiting game.
Now, I know some of you might be wondering about the future of PS3 emulation on Android, and if it'll ever reach a point where it works smoothly. Honestly, it's an exciting thought. Emulator development is a complex journey, but with advancements in performance optimization, controller support, and device compatibility, the possibilities are endless. And let me tell you, as soon as a more stable version of a PS3 emulator drops, I'll be the first to dive in, test it out, and share all the details with you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. It's your support that drives me to create even more awesome content. Every like, comment, and subscription keeps me motivated to test, explore, and bring you the latest in the world of emulation. And if you're curious about Yuzu, an amazing emulator for Switch games, check out this video here. Or, if you want to hear my thoughts on Winlator, another emulator I've been testing, make sure to watch this one. There's so much more exciting content on the way, so stay tuned. As always, this is Kuro and Violet, signing off.